Good to be chatting again here on Flow with the member for Barker, who we did talk about after the election, whether he'd put his hand up for a shadow ministry, and you've jagged one, Tony.
Well, I'm very honoured to be asked by Peter Dutton to serve in his shadow executive as the Shadow Assistant Minister for Infrastructure and Transport.
And that, I gather, looking at the list in the Dutton ministry, makes you, from the Liberal Party perspective, really the senior spokesperson for the government regarding infrastructure and transport.
Yeah, that's right. With Bridget McKenzie, a member of the National Party, as the senior minister, I suppose you can say I'm the Liberal with responsibility for infrastructure and transport.
Now, there's a whole lot that the government was doing while it was in government for a period of time, I guess improving regional roads. How does that work continue under the Albanese government?
Well, it's really important that we remember that the coalition government from 2013, having been elected on a mandate of building the roads of the 21st century, delivered over 35,000 projects, $200 billion of investment. We left government bequeathing to the Anthony Albanese Labor government a pipeline of $120 billion worth of projects under construction and or in the planning phases. What I want to see is that each and every one of those projects comes to fruition. I'm very concerned that the budget will be recast in October. And there will be, I expect, a temptation to rob Peter to pay Paul, and in a Labor context, that's diverting money away from hard infrastructure into soft projects, social capital type building exercises. Whereas what I want to see is roads, rail, ports, airports. I want to see them all built out because that's how we drive productivity. We've seen an increase in the minimum wage, which was championed by Anthony Albanese Labor government as their first order of business, which is fine. The concern I have is wage increases need to be a product of productivity dividends, and this one wasn't. So we really need to double down now on infrastructure, which brings that productivity bonus, which can lead to better lifestyles, higher wages, and better outcomes for everyone.
Well, you mentioned the budget in October. It's a bit unusual to have an October budget, but it is a post-election budget for the new government, and I've started to pick up commentary from Mr Albanese about budget repair, which we didn't hear much about when they were in opposition. And Mr Michael McCormack, who we catch up with regularly, the member for Riverina for the Nationals, has said he fears that usually it is regional Australia that's the first to cop that robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario.
Well, the tendency of incoming Labor governments is to shift the pendulum away from the regions, principally because very few of their elected members work in regional Australia. And so it's very easy to concentrate the effort in metropolitan settings. The problem with that is the wealth of this nation is generated in the regions, whether it's through primary industry or mining. And later this week I'm visiting the Mantina quarry close to where you are, Ricky. It's,
friends of the station, yes.
Yep, reminding myself of the importance of mining to regional Australia, even in an electorate like mine, which is principally a primary industries kind of powerhouse. But the concern I've got is we end up servicing metropolitan Australians at the cost of regional Australians. So whether it's Michael McCormack, myself, Susan Lee, Dan T and other members of the Liberal and National parties who live and work in regional Australia will have an eagle eye on what this budget is saying for regional Australia, because it's one thing at election time to provide the platitudes. Platitudes don't build roads, they don't develop port infrastructure, they certainly don't build, repair and maintain our airport infrastructure. So I'm looking for those dollars in the budget that will do those things.
Now, when you look at your portfolio, which covers the whole of Australia, the amount of agricultural production coming out of regional Australia is huge at the moment, and it looks like another big year with the wet that we've had in recent times, and looks like it might keep happening. This sort of puts a lot of huge burden on roads and needing to get goods on rail, whether it's the Murray Basin rail project across the border in Victoria, or even I think you and I talked previously about the Mallee in South Australia, and trying to alleviate that freight burden on roads. Is that a focus for the opposition?
Well, the opposition and the Liberal and National parties have never been biased when it comes to infrastructure expenditure. It feels a little bit in South Australia like there's been a bias towards roads relative to rail. But when you look at the nationwide picture, whether it's the projects you just mentioned, Ricky, or indeed the once in a century investment in the Melbourne to Brisbane Inland Rail project, the Liberal and National parties certainly have no problem with investment in rail infrastructure. And in fact, it's something that I'd like to bring to this portfolio, particularly as it relates to South Australia, a reimagining of what infrastructure investment needs to look like for the long term. Quite aside from rail, there's also, my view, as I said during the election campaign, a real need to consider duplicating the Sturt Highway in full, the Dukes Highway in full, and long term, from my perspective, a bridge over Springcart Gully so that we no longer need to treat Renmark or take heavy vehicle traffic into Renmark on its way to Mildura. But the advantage of opposition, I think, having spent only a few months in it thus far, is it provides a little bit more time for you to stop and think and develop policies about the bigger picture. And I'm looking forward to being part of the team that develops an infrastructure policy and plan for the coalition when it returns to government, which from my perspective I hope to be 2025, and certainly something we're working towards.
Now, just to be clear on that duplication of the Sturt Highway, for those listeners who might have picked that up across the border, we're talking from Adelaide to the South Australian border. You'd want to duplicate, or you see it going even further up to Mildura?
Well, it's not something I've consulted with outside of South Australia, and I've certainly done that consultation in relation to South Australian elements, having previously done so in my capacity as the member for Barker. I'm looking forward to travelling around the nation and considering these projects more broadly, having had the opportunity to speak to people in other states about what their priority needs are. But I can tell you from a South Australian perspective, right up there in terms of priority are the duplication of those two significant national road corridors. And I should say, Ricky, they're both listed on Infrastructure Australia's plan. They're just not listed as a priority, and that's what we need to consider. And I'm certainly encouraging Infrastructure Australia to recast them as priority projects.
Well, Tony Passon, Shadow Assistant Minister, I should say, for Infrastructure and Transport and member for Barker. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky.